Denazify? That's hard to do when you're acting like the Nazis.
So this is a subject that's very interesting to me, to just kind of look at how the media, how our education have faltered immensely, I believe. And the way that not just the U.S., but the world looks at history and how it can so easily be skewed or suppressed in some ways. There's a big move right now in the media to compare Vladimir Putin with Adolf Hitler. And there are obviously a number of similarities there. Primarily, they are brutal dictators, right? They're brutal dictators. But that is not the obvious choice. So why are they doing this? Why do they go to Adolf Hitler as the primary comparison to who Vladimir Putin here has become? I think it's a real problem. It's a real manifestation of the failure of our schools, the failure of our media in bringing us a historical context to today's events. This is something that should be staring each one of us right in the face. Maybe you're not aware of it either. When I was in elementary school in California, we used to have 3 different drills that we had to go through when we were in class. One of them was pretty universal everywhere. I think that was a fire drill, right? You had a fire drill, the alarm goes off, and you have to go out. You know, we had 2 doors at our elementary school. Ours was an outdoor school, number of buildings, and you'd walk out the classroom door and you'd go outside, and we'd line up right out onto the blacktop, which was right out in front of the classrooms. The second drill we had was more because of the geographic area that we were in California. And that was an earthquake drill. And we'd get down underneath our desks when the alarm went off. Our teacher would tell us what to do. We'd get down underneath our desk. We had to stay down there. We covered our heads. And, it was maybe 30 seconds, something like that. But there was a third drill that we did also. And that was a nuclear bomb drill. And so the alarms would go off. We did the exact same thing we would do with an earthquake drill. I don't know how this would protect you. The desks aren't going to protect you against an onslaught of radioactive material. But we'd get down underneath our desks, cover our heads, and they would tell us that this is a bomb drill. It had to do with the Cold War. If something were to happen. When I was in elementary school, we weren't that far removed from when the Soviets tried to place, under JFK, tried to place the missiles in Cuba, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis. And so it meant something. It was important. And many of you grew up during the time of the Cold War. We are Cold War kids. It's a good band, by the way. So we knew of the constant threat of the 2 major superpowers in the latter portion of the 20th century. It was the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, another example from when I was in elementary school, when I was in the 5th grade, I remember a textbook. I remember this specifically because I remember the image that they created for this section on politics. And I grew up in a very, very heavily hippie type of school district all the way through my high school. Now, these were definitely the flower children of the 60s that were teaching in my schools. And it was definitely in the school board and in the administration of these schools. And so the textbooks would go right along with that, of course. And the image that I had where it was explaining to us 5th graders the difference between the left and the right. Okay, they had it on a single line spectrum. You guys know how I don't like that. But that's how they had it, a single line spectrum. And on one extreme end of the left, what would you think the extreme end of the left is? Well, what they had was a hippie in some bell bottoms with showing a peace sign, right? And then on the right, the far extreme right, they had a Ku Klux Klan member with a hood on. That was how they taught their elementary kids about what the difference between the two extremes are in the political spectrum. So you have a Ku Klux Klan member on the right, you have a hippie on the left. And I remember even then thinking, this is really weird. Like, I knew what the Ku Klux Klan was and how horrific it was. And then I saw the hippie and I'm like, well, is that as bad as it really gets on the left? And of course, the answer is no, right? The greatest slaughter of lives and imprisonment and torture and poverty and starvation comes from the hard left in the 20th century. But most of you were not taught this, or at a minimum, most of your kids or grandkids are not taught this. So why do I bring this up? What does this have to do with Putin? Putin grew up under the Soviet Union. He was in the KGB in the Soviet Union. He wants to recreate the Soviet Union. The current war with Ukraine is simply the linchpin that is needed to be able to expand beyond that. This has been his dream, and it's been this for a very long time. When he invaded Ukraine the first time, 8 years ago in 2014, and annexed Crimea, that was the easiest thing for him to get, probably, without opposition. That was simply a move toward putting his toe into the water to move forward in his expansion toward building back the USSR. This is pretty obvious. We've known this for a long time. Congress has known this for a long time. The CIA have known this for a long time. Military intelligence has known this for a long time. But as he's gone into the Ukraine this time around, listen to his words. Listen to what he's saying. Is he saying anything that would compare to Hitler in terms of ideology? Or is he reaching back, just like wanting to build back that Soviet Union, is he reaching back to the rhetoric of the Soviet Union, to the days of Stalin and to the days of Lenin and the October Revolution in Russia? Because that was the great split in Europe, right? It was the Marxian communists on one side with Russia and the Soviet Union, and the fascists on the other. And who was one of the fascists in Europe? The fascist in Europe, it was Adolf Hitler, who was opposite of the Soviet Union. So what rhetoric is Putin using today? Well, he called Zelensky and the leaders of Ukraine Nazis. He's calling them Nazis and what? And fascists. Why is he pulling that kind of rhetoric? Do you think Hitler would be invading Poland and calling them Nazis and fascists? This is not the same thing. But we use that example and we easily fall into that example because that's what we're taught constantly. And there's a little bit of a reason for that, right? I mean, Hitler was the enemy, the primary enemy, obviously, in Europe. And in fact, the USSR, the Soviet Union, were our allies, at least in the war against Hitler. And so our men never fought face to face in battle with the USSR. We were in battle with Hitler in Europe, then of course Japan over in the Pacific. So that does matter, and that's a part of our history. But so is the Cold War. And for the Russians and for the Ukrainians, the history there is much, much deeper with Lenin and Stalin and the Soviet Union. This has gotten built up to the point where there are now memes about this. There's a fake Time magazine cover of Putin as Adolf Hitler on this. And no, it wasn't a real Time cover, but it's something that is passed around through social media quite a bit because that's the comparison that we make as a culture. This is a mistake. It's a big mistake. But without an education that we've received in our schooling, and without the media being willing to call out hard left atrocities and hard left horrific leaders that created genocide and mass murder, then our default is to go to Hitler, even when it is staring us in the face with someone like Vladimir Putin, whose legacy goes back to Stalin and to Lenin. So here in the Mirror in the UK, they've got a headline here that says, Vladimir Putin is doing exactly what Hitler did when he invaded Poland in 1939. And this whole focus going back to, oh, look at the point we're in Europe again. This is 1939 with Hitler. No, that's not the same thing. Not unless you're trying to reach into some other assumption. This is not the same thing. This is Lenin and Stalin. It's obviously Lenin and Stalin. They're going back and trying to build back what Lenin and Stalin built. And this kind of media is everywhere. And you probably think this. You're probably lined up with this already in your mind thinking, yeah, Putin is Hitler. Putin's like Hitler. Look, two horrible, horrible men. The problem is this dynamic that we have in our contemporary society in the West, where we are not, especially in the U.S., where we are not given the education of what happened with the Soviet Union because it's uncomfortable for those who are in charge of education to talk more about those atrocities of the 20th century. But, you know, when you don't have the history in place, when you don't learn the history, then you're likely to repeat it. Now listen to this, what Colbert brings up one night even. It's astonishing to me, the irony of comparing Putin to Hitler in place of Lenin or Stalin.
Putin announced the start of his war around 10 p.m. our time last night, and he had a pretty lame excuse to justify it.
I've taken the decision to conduct a special military operation. Its purpose is
very
to protect people who have been subject to abuse and genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years.
Propaganda.
And to do this, we will strive to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.
Denazify? That's hard to do when you're acting like denazis.
All right, so do you get that? Why here Putin is saying it himself. He's going against what he sees or what he's putting out there as propaganda of the Nazis, who is the regime of the Ukrainians. And here Colbert tries to make a joke by saying, how are you, because Putin says we're going to denazify the Ukraine. And he's making a joke saying, how can you denazify them when you are the Nazi? No, you're not the Nazi. You're the communist. You are the Marxist. And that's why you're using that rhetoric. And I'm going to tell you here in a little bit, further on in the episode here, how this makes more sense for Putin. It's not just his background. It's not just that he wants to recreate the Soviet Union. It's what's going on in Russia still. He has more support than our media typically gives us. Or so it may seem. Now, I want to go over these two examples of Lenin and Stalin and start putting you into the shoes of the Ukrainians a little bit more and not our American media, right? Back in 1917, October of 1917, this is when Lenin takes control of through the revolution of Russia to some degree. There's a number of years here where they still have to go through a civil war. And during this time, he executes what is called the Red Terror, where he is going to use force and murder and imprisonment and torture and poverty to make things happen the way he wants it to and repress any of the rebels who are called the whites that he is going to, that are not in support of Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the communist Marxian revolution. Well, a similar thing is going on in Ukraine, where you have some people that are sympathetic to the communist movement. And Ukraine becomes the first additional territory to align with Russia and the Communist Party of what becomes the Soviet Union. But not without war, not without murder, not without, well, let's go over this. This is an example here. During that Red Terror early on that was going on in Russia, it was also going on in Ukraine. And they formed the precursor to the KGB, which was called the Cheka. And here's Martin Latsis, who is the chief of the Ukrainian Cheka. And he stated in the newspaper called Red Terror the following, I quote, "We are not fighting against single individuals." Notice how this collectivism is always created. They want to take away individuality because that's how you take away humanity. And when you're looking at movements today, and if they're trying to put you into groups, that's where you've got to watch out, because you're creating a distance from an individual, their own feelings, their own agency, their own humanity. So he starts out and says, "We are not fighting against single individuals." This is the tactic. "We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class," right? Those that are more well off. "Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. This is not what you need to worry about." This is exactly like CRT and intersectionality. All you have to do is look at, for example, the color of their skin. Just look at their background. That's what he's going to say. Same exact idea. He says, instead, ask him to which class he belongs. What color is your skin? What's your background? And what is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. What is that fate? That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror. So this was in Ukraine. This is what is going on. So if you had gotten ahead by merit, something CRT and intersectionality and whiteness is studies of whiteness are very much against, then big problem, right? You're going to have an issue. You're probably either going to be dead or have everything confiscated and or be thrown into a gulag, right, into a prison. Now, in 1917, when the revolution took place in Russia, there were 518,000 what we call Kulak households. The Kulaks was a name that was given to the peasants that were, well, the farmers that were more successful, and they held a little bit more land. They had at least about 8 acres of land, and they were more successful in producing. They were better farmers. And they might hire individuals to help them. They might have machines to help them produce more and farm more. Well, in the Russian steppe and the Ukrainian steppe areas, the farming land, the great agricultural steppes region, and during the Ukrainian Soviet War from 1917 to 21, right? There's a war going on here. This is the history of Ukraine. The Kulaks farms were completely destroyed during this Soviet war with them. The Bolsheviks, Lenin's Marxist communist group, confiscated all of their surplus grain, land, and in many cases, even their means of production, including their livestock and their machines. Okay. So then we move from Lenin to his successor Stalin, and down the road a little bit in time, going down about another 10 to 15 years. And Anne Applebaum writes a lot about this. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and writer and commentator and expert on Leninism, Marxism in the Russia and the Soviet Union. And she was saying that at this time with Stalin in, I believe it's 1931-ish, 1929 to 1931, Stalin's already arrested tens of thousands of Ukrainian teachers, intellectuals, or they've removed the Ukrainian language from books and the schools and the libraries. And the Soviet leaders at this time, what they did with Stalin is they took all of the excess grain that was available, any of the excess grain that was available in the Ukraine, and they took it away from Ukraine. Why? Because they were repressing the Ukrainians, because there was a strong uprising, rebellious feeling in Ukraine against the Soviet Union and against Russia and Stalin. And he wanted to repress all of this. He did not want to move back to the time of a civil war with Ukraine. So he's trying to force a cultural change that gets much more aligned with Russia. This is Ukrainian history. Now, later, we get a little bit more information from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who is a soldier in the Soviet army in the time of World War II. He was a communist. He was thrown into a gulag, right? Which are the gulags are the Soviet prisons, where it's primarily you're put into forced labor. And he starts to change his mind quite a bit on what's going on. Now, he was already not pure enough, and that's why he's put into the gulags. He's not a pure enough Marxist or communist. And that purity is a very important thing when Marxism gets put into place. And he comes out and he says there were as many as 60 million people that were killed under Stalin. That's probably a little bit high. If we were to throw in Pol Pot and Mao and Kim Jong-il, then our numbers exceed probably over 100 million people. That's just who are killed. That doesn't include the tens of millions that were put into imprisonment and the families that were torn apart and the poverty and the torture that hard left tyranny, hard left Marxian tenets produced in the 20th century. But his estimate of 60 million under just Stalin is probably high. But of that number, whatever it is, under Stalin and his Great Purge and what was called under him the Great Terror, there were about 4 million Ukrainians that were killed. That was about 13% of their entire population. And there was a massive famine that was created because what Stalin did going in there is he tried to get rid of all the kulaks, anyone who were the better producers in farming. That it might be just they got up earlier and went to bed later. They worked harder. Not always, but they were good at what they did. Eliminated them. They threw most of them. They either killed them. Here's what they would do sometimes. They would go out and they would say, look, here is a region of people, of farmers in this region. You have to produce one person out of this region. Let's say it's 10 farmers. And one of these people has to die. And if you don't give that one person up, then it might be you. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to turn on everybody else because you don't want to be the person that's going to go. Now, what usually would substantiate the person that was going to get killed or thrown into the gulags? Well, they might have had an extra cow, right? They might have had a small machine left that they used to help produce in their farming. Can you understand how the idea of taking away merit, of removing that would cause problems, especially in farming? Well, it does. It creates a massive famine, not from nature, but man-made famine. As Stalin tried to create these farming collectives that would be run under the state. This is what ideological possession does. And a lot of people think that Lenin and Stalin were just power mad. That's not true. They were ideologically mad. They were orthodox to these Marxian tenets. They believed it to the day they died. And they were willing to go through any means necessary to get to this utopian end. The problem is, for those that think that they can try it a different way, we're going to try socialism this way or that way, and we can remove this part of this Marxian tenet. The problem is that the end is the exact same thing as the means. There is no utopia at the end. The Soviets killed or imprisoned or forced off their land all of the well-to-do peasants, right? Whatever that means, the well-to-do peasants who were considered enemies of the state under these Marxian tenets and this ideology. They drove the peasants off their farms by force, and Stalin's secret police further made plans to deport 50,000 Ukrainian farm families to Siberia, where there were not good ends there. A lot of those people died, maybe most of them. Here's a little tidbit on the village of Stavishke. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Stavishke. There was a young peasant boy who watched as the wanderers dug in empty gardens with their bare hands. Many were so emaciated, he recalled, that their bodies began to swell and stink from the extreme lack of nutrients. You could see them walking about, just walking, and one would drop, and then another, and so on it went. One year during the famine, it became obvious that the production of grain was going to fall short of the Soviet target by 60%. Now, if you kept what was there, that might have been just enough to feed more or less the peasants and the farmers. But what Stalin does instead, as Ann Applebaum writes, is that they took what little they had left and they confiscated it as a punishment for not meeting the quotas. They would actually go around the homes and the farm homes, the soldiers and the police. And if they found a little stash of anything anywhere in your kitchen, in a bedroom, under a bed, under a plank in the floor, they would take it, and who knows what they're going to do to you for it. They might take you, throw you off to a gulag. They might shoot you. That was what went on. This is in Ukraine. Now, this whole experience is called the Holodomor. And the Holodomor is a combination of Ukrainian words. They're the words for starvation, one, and to inflict death or murder, right? It's mass murder. This is what the Ukrainian part of their identity is. It's part of their heritage with the Soviet Union and with the leader of Russia. Now, this brings me to something else in regards to what's going on right now with Ukraine and may happen beyond that. This is very telling to me. This goes back to 1920, so this is still during the Soviet and Ukrainian war that's going on. This is still during the Russian Civil War that's still going on, right? The Marxian communists are still gaining more and more and more power and wielding their power in not great ways. But this comes from Trotsky, who is also another nefarious character who led the Red Terror and the Red Army and was later exiled by Stalin. But here's what it says. Here's what he says back in 1920. The severity of the proletarian dictatorship in Russia, let us point out here, was conditioned by no less difficult circumstances than the French Revolution. That's kind of interesting. That's a different discussion. There was one continuous front on the north and south, in the east and west. Besides the rebel armies, right, there were others who were attacking Soviet Russia simultaneously or in turn. The Germans, the Austrians, Czechoslovaks, Serbs, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, French, British, Americans, Japanese, Finns, Estonians, Lithuanians. In a country throttled by a blockade and strangled by hunger. All right, this is Well, that's kind of what's happening now, right? Think of all of the sanctions that are being put on Russia right now. There are Trotsky says, conspiracies, risings, terrorist acts, and destructions of roads and bridges. Think about how wars turn. Where is this going to go? As more and more sanctions are put on Russia and their economy sinks, that is a pressure for sure. Are the people going to get upset about it? Do they start to turn against those that are are enforcing the sanctions? Think about how wars turn. What about the Russian soldiers who originally, some of them didn't even know what they were doing, or that they were told that they were going to be welcomed with open arms as they crossed the border going into Ukraine? As they sit there in a tank and they look around them and another tank is destroyed by an anti-tank missile, or they're fighting with their automatic weapons one next to another, and their companion, their fellow soldier right next to them gets shot and is killed. And if that goes on and on and on, and there's that constant threat of harm and death, things start to turn a little bit. And it might become easier and easier to rally that Russian army as the Ukrainians, who perhaps were not seen as enemies before, now easily settle in as the adversary, as the enemy, as the evil ones against the Russian troops. Now, here's the next question. For those that are pro-socialist, and there's more and more of them all the time, and you can see them in my comment section on YouTube. There's more and more of them all the time. You see a lot more pro-socialist individuals that are young in their 20s and college students, because they didn't live during the Cold War. They don't know where this goes. And of course, again, our education system does not teach them. And the media doesn't talk about it. It doesn't talk about the downfalls of Marxian tenets and socialist tenets. But why are the Ukrainians fighting so hard and passionately against the Russians? Do you think they want to repeat history? As we sit here in our comfortable homes and watch our large screen TVs and our media with the talking heads telling us that Putin is like Hitler, why do you think they are fighting so hard against the Russians? They do not want to repeat history. They do not want to be absorbed by a dictatorship of hard left idealism that Putin seems to be following again. This is his background. This is his rhetoric. It's like asking yourself, when the rubber hits the road and you have individuals that, I'm trying to think of his name right now. I can't think of his name. The guy that wears the unbuttoned shirt and the baseball cap and does the documentaries. Michael Moore, where he visited Cuba and would come back and give us the reports of how incredible the healthcare system is in Cuba and how wonderful things are and how great Fidel Castro was. Right? You had the same thing from Danny Glover, who visited Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez, and said the same thing. Of course, we know what has happened to Venezuela. But ask yourself, where are all the boats coming from? Are they leaving Florida and going to Cuba because of how incredible things are in Cuba? Or are they coming from Cuba and landing in Florida? That pretty much tells you what you want to know. And I think it's the same thing with the Russian-Ukraine war. Listen to Putin's rhetoric and look at the passion that the Ukrainians are fighting with. Now, I wanted to get back to why I think Putin may have more support than you think. There was recently a poll, that was put out in Russia, And it asked, who is the most outstanding person in world history? World history. The Russians voted Joseph Stalin as the most outstanding person in world history. Guess who number 2 was? Of course, Vladimir Putin. And why is he seen as this most outstanding person? It goes right to my point in this episode. The reason is because he's seen as representing as an icon of identity for the Russians, for the man who defeated Hitler and the Nazis. Now, I want to finish with one more little clip here. This is from John McCain. And interestingly enough, this comes back from 2014 when Putin was annexing Crimea from Ukraine.
Putin himself said the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. Some of us who understood him understood that he was going to take Crimea.
Okay, so again, this was already known as he was going into Crimea. This wasn't some conspiracy about some kind of right-wing conspiracy saying that he was going to expand and then take Ukraine and then go out and start to go back and create the Soviet Union. You remember the feedback I do, the pushback from this kind of thought that came from some politicians and other pundits of how ridiculous this was. Remember, in just 2 years earlier, in the 2012 presidential campaign, it was Romney and Obama in the debate where Romney said that something to the effect of that Russia was the greatest threat internationally at that time. Now, he said now he thinks it's China over the long term, but in the here and now, he felt it was Russia. And then, of course, that's when Obama famously went and had the line of something to the effect of, hey, the 1980s called and said they want their foreign policy back, right? Well, when you understand geopolitics, you understand that as things change, they stay the same. And here now, Putin and Russia are making the next move to take all of Ukraine and then expand out from there. Let's continue a little bit more with John McCain.
Senator, those are some strong comparisons there, putting Putin effectively in the same camp as a Stalin or even Hitler. Is that appropriate? Should we be
stop here? Okay, so even her here, right? Even at this point, Bloomberg here, this host, she says that's pretty strong words that you're putting Putin in, comparing him to a Stalin and even Hitler. Now, there's two things you can look at here. Well, she might be thinking Stalin is the most obvious choice, but you're even going to Hitler. But more likely, what she's saying, well, is Stalin was pretty bad, but man, Hitler was horrific. And you're comparing him even with Hitler because McCain had brought up that he's kind of like a Stalin or a Hitler. But you see, it's the same problem. She doesn't know or think or has been trained not to believe that someone like a Stalin was as bad or worse than an Adolf Hitler.
Let me make it clear. He wants to restore the old Russian Empire, and that means the near abroad. And Ukraine is the crown jewel of that, and that's why he's acting like he is. Sevastopol is vital to the Russian Empire because of its access to the Mediterranean, which is why I predicted he would do what he did.
Okay.
We must understand him for what he is, and the president may think the Cold War is over.
This would be Obama back then.
The 19th century is over, but Vladimir Putin doesn't.
Okay, and there you go, right? Things just become the same. And that's the point. I agree 100% with his point. The president might think it's over, so that would have been 2014, that would have still been Obama at that time. And that was back in the last century. But Putin doesn't think that. And that's the whole point. Putin is a Stalin. Putin is a Lenin. Now, would you make that kind of comparison? Absolutely. If you're going to make a comparison with Hitler, as far as deaths and mass genocide and killings and mass murderings and torture. There is nobody worse. I don't think you can find a worse leader and person. I don't think there's honestly, I don't think there's a worse person in the 20th century. No one has ever perhaps had as much, possibly Mao, but there's nobody worse than Joseph Stalin in the 20th century. And Putin wants to bring Russia back to the great empire of the Soviet Union again. The obvious choice here, without insulting our intelligence, without desecrating history, without being manipulated by education, the apparatus of education and the apparatus of media. Putin should be compared to Lenin and Stalin.